Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? The Hamilton soundtrack has been on in our house nonstop for the past 6 months. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? What story will be told when this past year is history? The sheer number of possible narratives is staggering. I'll start with my own. Like many of you, we are a 2-working parent family with 2 young children. Our boys are 7 and 5. Schools and work went remote. Childcare disappeared. And a previously unimaginable juggling act ensued. Distance learning, staggered schedules, and working at every free moment became our new reality. Early in the shutdown, our friends and family in the Barnert community started getting sick. Many of your loved ones, parents, siblings, partners, children, contracted COVID-19. Too many of them died. And your stories were part of my story, which I say with humility and love. There was no off switch. Constant funeral and Shiva planning, updates by text and phone, keeping track of burial backlogs, and ever-changing cemetery procedures. Also, gathering in huge numbers on Zoom for Shabbat, figuring out how to celebrate B'nai Mitzvah students and their families, welcoming new babies from afar, guiding couples and families crushed by canceled weddings and graduations and every other kind of celebration. My story is similar to many of yours, complete with all the complexities that come along with navigating social lives when everyone's rules for social engagement are different. Many uncertainties remain in our life today, but there are also many things we don't lose sleep over right now. We can feed our family. We have the kinds of jobs that have kept us largely working successfully from home. Even with the stress of the past 6 months, we are so deeply lucky. But there are so many different stories, many not as lucky. Some of us live alone, and the isolation has been crippling. Karen Collar, age 69, of Clark, Pennsylvania, shared her story. The company of my colleagues has disappeared, and I find myself alone at home, parked in front of a computer for 10 hours a day, with just the company of my cat. I am disoriented, unfocused, lonely, sad, and worried. I don't deal well with the unknown, so I feel that I have control of nothing. The future does not exist. How could I have taken so much of my life, filled with the company of friends and family, for granted? I'm existing and not living, the days going by with no sense of accomplishment. Almost 50 million people in the United States filed for unemployment since the start of the pandemic. 50 million people out of work, and many of them were already living in or on the edge of poverty. A disproportionate number of those in this huge group are Black and Brown Americans, Latinos, and other people of color, gig workers, people in the service, food, retail, entertainment industries, and more. People like Austin from Los Angeles. His primary income was as a technician for a company that repairs and services commercial-grade coffee machines. In addition, Austin makes music as a hip-hop artist and coaches youth basketball for a travel team. This last year has been a tornado, even before the pandemic, Austin says. Last May, the company I worked for got bought by a big corporation. They told us our jobs were safe. It turns out that was a lie. We all got laid off. For the next 6 months of 2019, I was on unemployment. I applied for hundreds of jobs, and then I finally got hired by my current employer. I had only been at this job for 3 months. Then this pandemic happened and wiped out my new source of income. There are stories of children orphaned when their parents died from COVID-19. Families forced to move into shelters from loss of work and wages. food banks unable to respond to extreme food insecurity, medical professionals and hospital employees who have been navigating the fear of working in hotspots, fear for their own health and that of their families. Working mothers have, in many cases, been more negatively affected than working fathers, as families have been forced to adjust to remote everything. So many people in so many industries have had to choose between returning to uncertain and often unsafe work environments or accepting a total loss of wages and the economic despair that followed. Around here, there are also the stories of those who are more fortunate, whose financial outlook has stayed the course or even improved in these months. Savings from camp refunds or vacations not taken, or changes in lifestyles, more eating in, fewer options for entertainment. The divide in this country over wealth and access to resources continues to widen. Our stories continue to diverge. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? What will be the story we record from this pandemic? Whose perspective, built as perspectives are, from truths ranging from the widely known and broadly experienced to the personally felt, whose perspective will be the most instructive for history's records? These questions came from an article I read in March, and I haven't been able to shake them. How will our divergent stories be assembled when the story of the pandemic is at last written? Epidemics are a category of disease that seem to hold up the mirror to human beings as to who we really are, writes Frank M. Snowden, no relation to Edward, Professor Emeritus of History and the History of Medicine at Yale. That is to say, they obviously have everything to do with our relationship to our mortality, to death, to our lives. They also show the moral relationships that we have toward each other as people, and we're seeing that today. The point here, I think, is that there is a moral dimension to this pandemic, one that urgently requires our attention. Diseases move along the fault lines of poverty, and how a society responds reflects either the best or the worst of its participants' sense of moral responsibility to one another. And right now in America, it's not looking so good. In the biblical book of Numbers, the people are wandering in the Midbar, in the wilderness, in a place of uncertainty. Moses sends scouts to check out the new land, to see what kind of country it is. He asks, "Are the people who dwell there strong or weak, few or many?" Commenting on this verse from his vantage point in 12th century France, our great teacher Rashi explains what Moses might have meant when he asked if the promised land was strong or weak. Rashi teaches, if the inhabitants live in fortified cities, they are weak. If they live in open cities, however, they are strong. A weak city is closed. A strong city is open. Why? We become stronger when we are open to one another, when we support one another, when we take down our literal and figurative walls, when we know that our society as a whole is less susceptible to the destructive impact of disease when the way we are living demonstrates responsibility for all people. I have to imagine that Rashi would put us in the weak category right now, living to a great extent behind walls which we hope will keep us safe. This time has been immensely stressful for all of us. We have lived through deaths of loved ones, physical and mental illness, loneliness, or underemployment, loss of all that was familiar, and national unrest. On Yom Kippur, I will be speaking in greater depth about a few of these topics. Today is Rosh Hashanah, the birthday of the world, a time for looking out from our little dwellings toward the wider universe of responsibility that we all inhabit together. We are asked to see ourselves in the context of, and with responsibility to, the many ecosystems in which we live. Our proverbial Sefer Chaim, our book of life, imagines a volume big enough to hold all of our names, along with prayers that we will be safe, healthy, recorded, and here to greet 5782 together next year, hopefully in person. This year, I worry deeply about the fraying binding of this book, meant to hold together each Sipor Chaim, each story of our lives, in our Sefer Chaim. I worry that in our desire to protect ourselves and our families, we have drifted even farther apart as a society, as a human family, into disconnected volumes of unrelated tomes. So, as I often do when I feel anxious and adrift, I returned, as we Jewish people do, to Torah, and to the way Moses prepares the Israelites for a new life in the Promised Land, a life informed by mutual responsibility and a shared narrative. Moses gave the Jewish people more than facts and figures, rules and regulations, for living in an uncertain land. He gave his people, our people, a story. He shared a vision of Jewish history and Jewish destiny. In the words of my colleague, Rabbi Max Chaikin, Moses tells them not only what we went through, enduring centuries of hardship before arriving at the Promised Land, but also what it all meant and why it was worth remembering. He connects the past to the present and the present to the future. In doing so, he teaches us to be a people of storytellers. Moses tells us a story that gives us a shared experience, gets us out of the dirt tracks of the wilderness, and emotionally engages us to pave the road to the Jewish future together. In so doing, Moses connected each of us. There's no more Moses, and there's no perfect response to this moment. How do we move forward? How do we reweave our stories into a stronger, more beautiful, more diverse, more cohesive strategy? I don't know what answer to give you. There is no simple response, no fortune cookie answer that you can put in your pocket and revisit when seeking direction. But whatever you answer, remember this: your pandemic story is connected in 1,000 ways to the stories of others. Whenever and however you eventually tell it, I would urge you to connect your story to those around you, to people you love and to people you don't know, to remember that strength is found in vulnerability and courage in our connectedness. Actually, that's what we can put in our pockets. The ability to say, I don't know, and I don't know, and I'm not satisfied, so I'll keep working at it, not by myself, but with everyone else going through this. This is the best promise we could make for the new year: to make peace with all that we don't know, and to remind ourselves that each story is sacred. That way, when we meet again next year, we will be proud of our contribution to the story of 5781. Who lives, who dies, who tells our stories? Our story continues. We are still mid-story. It is possible that when we look back at this pandemic, people will talk about this extended period as a dramatic turning point, as in the Hebrew word for repentance or turning, teshuvah, when we realize we have missed the mark and then correct our behavior. Look at what the epidemic revealed about inequity and inequality and need, they will say. And look how these individuals and families and communities engaged in teshuvah, turning to one another. They responded, nashuvah. We will respond and renew all life because of what we see. We see a reflection of our God, of our parents, of our children, of our lovers, in the faces of each person who struggles. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva, chadesh yameinu kekedem. Help us to turn to you, source of all life. May the new year renew our bodies and hearts and souls as we turn to one another in love. Shana Tova.